Catholic fans, welcome to episode 18. I'm super glad you're here. Our Catholic Live finale is coming soon. Don't forget, it's March the 14th. The event is already 63% sold out, so be sure to get your tickets to both the live finale and our Catholic walking tours at Catholic.com. Also, I'm going to reveal our first special guest joining us at the finale. Just stick around to the end of this episode to hear who it is. All right, that's it. Enjoy episode 18. This episode references historical moments that are violent and at times sexual. Listener discretion is advised. On the morning of August 1st, 1984, 16-year-old David Samples slides into a phone booth at the corner of Boulevard and Memorial Drive. Memorial Drive is a busy road that marks the southern boundary of Atlanta's Cabbagetown neighborhood. This early in the morning, the streets of Atlanta are still dark and mostly empty. It's August in the South, so it's also hot and humid, even at 4 a.m. David pulls a quarter out of his pocket. He has to make an important phone call. He's crying. That phone booth at Boulevard and Memorial is, of course, no longer there. I walk or drive by this intersection almost every day. It's just a couple of blocks south of my place in Cabbagetown. By 1984, Cabbagetown had fallen into near anarchy. The cotton mill that had anchored the neighborhood's economy for a century had closed back in the 70s. For the white working-class people of Cabbagetown, the shuttering of the mill was an economic catastrophe. These generations of Cabbagetown families had worked at that mill. And when it closed, many of the residents, already dirt floor poor, had few other options. Mass unemployment led to mass poverty, and the poverty swept in like a plague. The data show that around this time, Cabbagetown's annual income by household was about $7,000. As a point of comparison, that was about half of what other households around Atlanta brought in each year. The crime statistics were also pretty shocking. By Atlanta standards, Cabbagetown is a tiny neighborhood with a really small geographic footprint. Only 1,600 people lived there in the 1980s. The neighborhood's crime rate was a staggering 1.7 crimes for every 10 residents. At the time, that was twice the average for the rest of Atlanta. I suppose lots of people would assume 1980s Atlanta crime would be mostly the work of black gangs, but the reality is one of the most lawless neighborhoods in Atlanta back then was purely white. The unique thing about Cabbagetown's crime epidemic of the 1980s was that it was driven mostly by children. Back then, local reporters would journey into the neighborhood and write detailed stories on Cabbagetown, often likening it to the Lord of the Flies, with barefoot gangs of 4-foot-tall, pudgy-faced renegades wreaking havoc in the streets. One of those reporters was the brilliant journalist Susan Faludi, who, at the time, worked for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm drawing heavily here from an article she wrote in 1984 titled Children of Crisis. With lots of adults unemployed, sick, addicted, or incarcerated, the kids of Cabbagetown took over the streets. The stories from back then are pretty bad. One kid, fed up with his mom's drunk live-in boyfriend, smashed his head with a brick. Another 15-year-old reported seeing one of his friends beat his own mother with a belt, a reverse spanking, if you will. Street fights with guns and knives were common. In 1978, the Atlanta SWAT team swarmed into Cabbagetown after reports of a double-fisting 17-year-old walking down Berean Avenue with a rifle in one hand and a shotgun in the other. One resident said he looked like Wyatt Earp. Substance abuse was rampant as well. One kid reported that he'd been drinking beer with his dad since, quote, I was a baby, end quote. And unsurprisingly, lots of kids were hooked on drugs. Model airplane glue was the neighborhood nectar. It was inexpensive, easy to get, and huffing it gave a quick high. Tragically, there was also widespread child prostitution, which surprisingly attracted more boys than girls. Men slowly cruising through Cabbagetown looking for sex with kids had been a thing for as long as anyone could remember. An older lady named Lois wrote a letter to the editor of the Constitution back in the 80s. She remembered seeing men cruising the neighborhood for sex when she was a Cabbagetown kid way back in the 1930s and 40s. Predators are always drawn to pockets of downtrodden people, and for as long as anyone could remember, Cabbagetown had been very downtrodden. In the 80s, most of the boys drawn into prostitution just did it for the money, a quick buck for kids with few other options. They'd also travel beyond the borders of Cabbagetown to meet men, to well-known cruising hotspots like Grant Park or over in Midtown off Crescent Street. Police back then called these kids hustlers, and it was well known that the youngest ones always came from Cabbagetown. Boys as young as 8 were often seen getting into the cars of older men. David Samples, our crying 16-year-old kid in the phone booth at 4 a.m., he was one of those hustlers. By the time he was 16, David had been meeting men for years. He learned the lucrative ritual from his older brothers, Mike and Ronnie. However, by now, both Mike and Ronnie were serving time in jail. Mike, the middle brother, was incarcerated on charges of kidnapping. In her article, Susan Faludi tells a really disturbing story. When Mike was a kid, Ronnie taught him how to torture a chicken by holding a flame to its beak. Of the 3 boys, Ronnie was the roughest. In 1981, Ronnie was sentenced to life in prison for murder. As the story goes, he'd been picked up by a lawyer in Atlanta one night. For whatever reason, Ronnie decided to rob the guy instead, so he beat him unconscious and kept beating him. When Ronnie realized the guy was dead, he threw his body into a pond in South Atlanta. For his effort, he got $11 from the guy's wallet. So by the time David Samples stepped into that phone booth in August of 1984, his mother, Barbara Jackson, had endured more heartbreak than any person should have to bear. With 2 sons already behind bars for serious offenses, 16-year-old David was her last hope that one of her kids might get out of Cabbagetown and make something of himself. On this particular night, Barbara Jackson is jolted out of a sound sleep. She senses trouble. No good phone calls are made at 4 a.m. It's David, her 16-year-old son. She can tell he's sobbing. In an interview, Barbara later recounted the conversation. "Mama, I just called to say I love you." David's voice is a bit slurred. "David, are you messed up on any drugs?" she asks. "No, Mama. I'm just drinking some beer and hanging out." She doesn't know it, but he's lying. He continues. "Mama, I want to get locked up so I can be with Ronnie." Barbara leaps out of bed and frantically begins getting dressed. She tells him to hang on and that she's on her way. David hangs up the phone. As David sets down the receiver, Atlanta police officer John Oglesby is driving by that very same phone booth. Someone had called in to report that a young white man was walking down Memorial Drive shouting obscenities. Oglesby had been dispatched to investigate. According to the officer, as he approached the phone booth, he observed a person inside moving and motioning erratically. He rolls down his window to check on him. He's promptly greeted by a flurry of curses. David Samples is not here for a friendly chat. Oglesby parks his car in a nearby lot, opens the door, and gets out. David stumbles out of the phone booth, and as he does, he struggles to take off his shirt. He's now walking towards Officer Oglesby, shirtless, and shouting curses and nonsense. David pauses. He looks down and sees a bottle on the sidewalk. He bends over to pick it up and launches it in the direction of the officer. The boy keeps advancing, the situation escalating with each step. David Samples made several bad decisions that night, but his next one would be the costliest. As the bare-chested 16-year-old staggers towards Officer Oglesby, he reaches behind his back. Ogleby's training had conditioned him for moments just like this. His hand goes to his holster. When David Samples' hand reappears from behind his back, he's clutching a pocket knife. He begins opening it. But before he can, Officer John Oglesby draws his weapon and fires. 5 rounds rip through David's thin frame. He falls to the pavement. Streams of red. David Samples takes his last breath. Moments later, Barbara Jackson tops a hill on Memorial Drive, and as she does, she sees the blue and red flashes of police lights. By now, her instincts about her boys are rarely wrong. She knows David, her youngest son, is dead. The David Samples death made the local news. There was a major outcry amongst the Cabbagetown locals, accusations of police brutality. Local law enforcement released statements saying that John Oglesby responded appropriately. An officer being advanced upon by an armed combatant has the right to use lethal force, they said. The officer would later be officially exonerated of any wrongdoing. In her writing, journalist Susan Faludi said that Cabbagetown was under a dark cloud of, quote, pervasive fatalism. Fatalism, defined as the belief that all events are predetermined and therefore inevitable. Predetermined events, inevitable events. How does a tiny neighborhood in the heart of a prosperous city fall into such despair that the people just give up, resigning themselves to utter hopelessness? How do children in an American city become glue-sniffing, gun-wielding child prostitutes? And how does a mother lose 3 sons, viciously devoured by a single neighborhood? Well, it certainly doesn't happen overnight. Oh no. Pervasive fatalism creeps like a mold. It slithers like a snake across the decades and under the floorboards, suffocating light and laying new eggs in the dark. When people disdain people, evil begets evil. Greed begets greed. Hate begets hate. And if no one steps in, the darkness hatches anew with each generation. You're listening to episode 18 of Catlick, Trouble in the Cotton Empire. Welcome back. It's January of 1914, month 37 of our story. Leo Frank is imprisoned at the Fulton Tower as his legal team continues the appeals process. Meanwhile, our focus has shifted a mile or so east of downtown Atlanta to an area we call Cabbagetown. Now, for the sake of historical accuracy, I must acknowledge here that Cabbagetown wasn't always called Cabbagetown. It didn't pick up that name until about the 1940s. There are 2 competing stories for where the name came from. The first is that one time a truck full of cabbages overturned in the neighborhood, and the locals flooded the streets, gathered them up, and retreated back to their homes before being caught. The second, which is the story that I sort of prefer, is that the people of Cabbagetown were so poor, most of them could only afford cabbage for dinner. And so when other Atlantans would pass by at dusk, their noses would be greeted by the unmistakable, pungent odor of cabbage boiling in all the homes. Before it was called Cabbagetown, most people around the city referred to it as Factory Town or just the Mill Village. But for the sake of simplicity, I'll just be calling it Cabbagetown. In the last episode, I introduced you to Jacob Elsis, an orphaned Jewish immigrant who moved to Atlanta after the Civil War with the goal of starting a business. Based on what we know about him, Jacob Elsis was a brilliant entrepreneur. He started multiple businesses with various partners in the 1870s, and by 1881, he'd raised enough money from investors to buy some land east of downtown, the area we now call Cabbagetown. In 1881, the first bricks were laid for the Fulton Cotton Spinning Company. The main product of this new cotton mill would be fabric bags. Before the widespread use of plastic and cardboard boxes, most things were stored, carried, or shipped in large cotton bags. Elsis spotted a gap in the market and knew the demand was there. Atlanta could use a bag manufacturer of its own. Despite the opportunity, Elsis had one major hurdle to overcome: labor. In a pre-robotics world, staffing these giant factories was a pain in the ass. Hundreds and hundreds of bodies were needed to operate the mill and avoid interruptions in production. Other manufacturing facilities around Atlanta had been crippled by labor shortages in the late 1800s. So Jacob Elsis hatched a plan. He'd send recruiters far north, beyond Forsyth County, into the misty mountains of North Georgia. The southern Appalachian mountain range loosely begins in North Georgia and then stretches up the eastern coast of the U.S. all the way to Maine. The mill's recruiters landed in what's called the Piedmont region of the Appalachians. This is a rugged, densely forested area today, so you can imagine what it was like in the late 1800s. The Piedmont was an economically depressed area, so when recruiters from Fulton Bag showed up, promising steady jobs in the big city, people listened. Of course, this wasn't an isolated thing. This was happening all over as the Industrial Revolution swept across America. People uprooting their lives on rural farmsteads and relocating to cities and urban factories. Well, the recruitment plan was successful, and entire families began migrating to Atlanta to begin their new lives. Jacob Elsis arranged for simple wood-framed houses to be built on the land around the factory. Back then, it was fairly common for large industrial operations to provide on-site housing for their workers. And when you drive through Cabbagetown today, you'll see some of these same shotgun-style houses that were built more than 100 years ago. By 1881, the factory was fully staffed and open for business. And within several years, it was booming. By the 1890s, Elsis was adding more buildings to expand his production capacity. Around this time, they also renamed the facility. It was now the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill. With a proven process in place, Fulton Bag began expanding to other cities, opening up more mills in New Orleans, St. Louis, and beyond. All of this growth in the 1890s and into the 1900s began to make Jacob Elsis one of the wealthiest men in all of Atlanta. And he often used that wealth for good. He dispatched his wealth to make Atlanta better, making sizable donations to help establish the Grand Opera House, the Hebrew Orphans Home, as well as Grady Hospital and the Georgia Institute of Technology, two landmark Atlanta institutions that are still around today. By 1910, the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill in Atlanta was a massive operation. By revenue, it had become one of the top 500 corporations in all of America. Around 1,200 people packed into the mill each day, moving, cutting, spinning, sewing, and processing cotton into bags and a variety of other products. By 1913, Jacob Elsis had been at the helm of the mill for more than 30 years, and he was planning his retirement. By then, he'd already decided on his successor, his son Oscar, the oldest of his 8 children. The son of a millionaire, Oscar Elsis attended some of the finest schools in Europe. His dad was helping start Georgia Tech, so he came back to Atlanta to finish university as part of Tech's first graduating class in 1891. After finishing school, he worked for his dad at the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill. By the time of his father's retirement, Oscar was a vice president and a seasoned executive in the textile industry. So by 1914, he was the natural choice as Jacob's successor and heir to his cotton empire. Oscar officially took over as president in January of that year. Now, Oscar lived a grand life, rolling into the office every day in a shiny black automobile driven by a personal chauffeur. Around the time of his transition, he moved his family into a penthouse at the newly opened Ponce de Leon Apartments. The Ponce Apartments were unlike any other residences in the city. Rising 12 stories over Atlanta's posh thoroughfare, Peachtree Street, they included all the latest amenities: elevators, heating, maid service, mechanical refrigeration, sleeping porches, and even a European-style cafe on the first floor. By 1914, the building's tenant list read like a who's who of Atlanta's elites. Familiar names like the Inmans, the Elsises, and even a Candler. Oscar Elsis joined his Gentile elites as one of the first Atlanta Jews with a coveted Peachtree Street address. FYI, this building, miraculously, is still standing and is in great shape. It looks just like it did when it opened more than 100 years ago. It sits directly catty-corner to the Fox Theater in Midtown, so be sure to check it out if you ever visit the area. One of the most celebrated features of the Ponce de Leon Apartments was its rooftop gardens. Fancy galas were often held on the rooftop, and I can imagine Oscar standing with friends, looking south and proudly pointing to the smokestacks of the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill in the distance. However, while the Elsis family was settling into their new luxury lifestyle in Midtown, a very different story was playing out underneath those smokestacks back in Cabbagetown. In the 30 years since it had been opened, the Mill Village had been gradually degrading into what could only be described as a slum. Through decades of poverty and neglect, Cabbagetown had become a full-blown public health crisis. Children as young as 6 were hooked on tobacco. There was no trash collection. There was no plumbing, so the smell of feces filled the streets. Diseases like typhoid fever, malaria, tuberculosis, and smallpox were common in the overcrowded houses. One section of houses was known as Chinch Row because they were all infested with bedbugs. When the sun went down in Cabbagetown, an army of moonshiners and prostitutes invaded the streets, eager to make a buck off the factory's desperate workers. Multiple brothels operated in Cabbagetown, and STDs spread like wildfire. Over time, a cottage industry of saloons, bars, and brothels set up shop along the neighborhood's northern border, along present-day Decatur Street. Over the years, the mill had become the anchor of Atlanta's red light district, and its people were its best clients. The harsh reality was that even after 30 years, these workers recruited from the Appalachian Mountains, they just hadn't adapted to city life that well. This was a community of proud mountaineers in downtown Atlanta, working in harsh factory conditions for very little pay. This social experiment was starting to look very, very bad. One of those mountaineer men of Cabbagetown was a guy by the name of John Carson. When Carson moved to Atlanta, he brought his Appalachian music with him. And the key ingredient to Appalachian music? A fiddle. Back then, they actually had fiddling championships, and Carson was declared the Grand Fiddlin' Champion of Georgia on 7 different occasions. This eventually earned him the moniker Fiddlin' John Carson. Most people think country music got its start in Nashville, Tennessee. However, that's not exactly true. Country music really got its start in Cabbagetown, when Fiddlin' John Carson recorded what many believe to be the first ever recording of country folk music. Now, that all happened in the 1920s. In 1914, John Carson was just another worker at the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill, though he'd entertain with his fiddle in the alleyways and saloons whenever he could. It's worth mentioning here that Fiddlin' John Carson could be a real asshole. He had at least one super racist song, as well as a song called It's a Shame to Whip Your Wife on Sunday. Why? You may be wondering, was it a shame to whip your wife on Sunday? Just listen.
It's a shame to whoop your wife on Sunday. It's a shame to whoop your wife on Sunday. When you've got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. It's a shame to whoop your wife on Sunday.
Yeah, so there's that. Around this same time, we know that Fiddlin' John Carson wrote another song about a certain murder mystery in Atlanta.
Little Mary Fagan, she went to town one day. She went to the pencil factory to get her little pay.
This is the Ballad of Little Mary Fagan, written by John Carson. Vocals by his daughter, Rosa Lee. Leo Frank's about to get called out. Listen.
Leo Frank met her with a brutally harsh know. He smiled and said, Little Mary, now you go home no more. He sneaked along behind her till she reached the middle room. He laughed and said, Little Mary, you met your fate all doom. He fell upon her.
The lyrics. Leo Frank met her with a brutally heart we know. He smiled and said, Little Mary, you'll go home no more. Sneaked along behind her till she reached the metal room. He laughed and said, Little Mary, you have met your fatal doom. Now, I'm pointing this out to highlight a major social disconnect in Cabbagetown, the tension between the mill's poor Appalachian workers and its wealthy Jewish owner-managers. The economic rift between low-paid wage workers and wealthy elites isn't exactly unique. That happens in lots of big companies. But what was unique then was the added layer of anti-Semitism floating around Atlanta. That made it even worse. As the Atlanta papers continually demonized Leo Frank, his Jewish faith and heritage was often mentioned, and these correlations fed into a lot of stereotypes. That anti-Jewish bias eventually crept into Cabbagetown and was easily transferred over to the factory's Jewish ownership, whom many of the workers already despised. It seems likely that there was some unwarranted tension there. However, there was some warranted tension as well. And that seemed to be caused by one person, Oscar Elsis. Remember, Oscar's dad, Jacob, was an orphan immigrant who came from nothing. He knew what it was like to be dirt poor, so when he walked the floors of the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill, he likely felt some kinship with his poor Appalachian workers. He could see himself in them, simple, hardworking people just trying to get by. But his son, Oscar? Yeah, he was different. Remember, he was the son of a millionaire. He couldn't relate at all with these mill workers, nor did he try. He often called them the help, and viewed them as just generally shiftless, irresponsible, and inherently immoral. He had nothing in common with them, so he didn't really care to get to know them. Oscar also employed the largest office staff of any mill in the South, and they sort of served as a buffer between him and his blue-collar workforce. Oscar's management style was also very different than his father's. he was a heavy-handed autocrat known for belligerent fits of rage. He had a short fuse with the workers who he viewed as low-class simpletons. Descriptions of work inside the mill under Oscar sound like a living hell. I'm drawing here from the work of Clifford Kuhn and Gary Fink, two historians who've done amazing research on the mill. Oscar authorized a 60-hour work week, which kept workers on their feet for 11 to 12 hours straight. He was obsessed with efficiency, so lunch breaks were limited to 30 minutes or less. Fink describes the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill as a fortress, surrounded by tall walls studded at the top with spikes and broken glass. The windows of the mill were made of smoked glass. That way, workers didn't waste time by looking outside. Conditions inside the mill were just generally toxic, so workers got sick a lot. Some said working in the mill was like working in an oven, and they suffered from chronic pain, fatigue, and migraine headaches. Workers also reported that managers spoke to them like they were dogs. Women claimed sexual harassment was a common occurrence. Now, maybe all of this would be bearable if the pay was good, right? Well, pay records show workers in the card room made about $8 per week. When adjusted for inflation and sort of spread out over the year, this equates to a modern-day salary of about $9,000 annually. But even that wasn't guaranteed due to Oscar's crazy fining system. At Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill, you could be fined for anything: breaking equipment, showing up late, or even taking an unauthorized water break. Of course, you could have your fines forgiven simply by reporting fellow employees for shoddy work. Oscar rewarded tattling, knowing that this would keep workers suspicious of each other, a sly tactic designed to undermine employee unity. One of the most hated aspects of working at Fulton Bag was the dreaded contract that employees were forced to sign. For one, employees could be fired for any reason at any time. Furthermore, after working, you had to wait a week to receive your pay. You were also required to give a week's notice before quitting, and if you didn't, you forfeited that week's worth of pay. Now, this might not sound like a big deal, but for very poor people with no savings and no other means to provide, this could be financially devastating. It could mean that your kids don't eat for an entire week. This last point, the one about withholding workers' pay, was quite unusual because no other mill in Georgia had a clause like that. Over time, Oscar was criticized for it, and some even questioned whether it was legal for him to enforce it. His response? A direct quote. "I have made up my mind on the subject, and I will not change the contract system until hell freezes over. I would sooner shut down these mills and keep them so until moss and any other kind of vegetation would grow over their windows than agree to change my attitude upon that question." Yeah, Oscar, not one for mincing words. Perhaps Oscar's greatest shame lied in his use of child labor. This was the mill's dirty little secret. Company records show that about 12% of the workforce was between the ages of 10 and 16. These children worked the same 60-hour week as everybody else, and it wreaked havoc on their health. One mom reported that her young daughter had breathing problems, constant headaches, and walked with a stoop. Over time, the mill's oppressive work environment took its toll. How bad was it? Well, in 1 year, 10,000 people worked in a factory that only had 1,200 jobs. That's 10,000 people for 1,200 jobs. That's a turnover rate of more than 800%. As a matter of comparison, similar mills around Georgia reported turnover around 25%. When confronted with that stat, Oscar said that the other mill owners, they're just cooking the numbers to make themselves look better. All of this was building. As the anger grew, as the desperation grew, rumors began to spread through the back alleys of Cabbagetown and in the pubs over on Decatur Street frequented by Fulton bag workers. A storm was coming, and even in his ivory tower on Peachtree Street, Oscar Elsas would not be able to avoid it. By February of 1914, Leo Frank had settled into his cell at the Fulton Tower, having resigned himself to make the best of a bad situation. He kept his cell neat and tidy. He exercised daily and received visits from friends and family who'd bring him food, coffee, and newspapers. When the Constitution caught wind of this, they published a story about it. Shocker. Headline: Cell now like living room. Behind the scenes, efforts were made to build a coalition of wealthy and influential Jewish supporters from across the nation to help fund and promote Frank's cause. However, even amongst these Jewish leaders, this effort was met with skepticism. Some worried that if they interfered too much in the case, there could be a big public backlash. Anger that Jewish outsiders, or worse yet, Jewish Northerners, were meddling with justice in the South. Nevertheless, several big names threw their hat in the ring, deciding that the PR risk was worth trying to save Leo Frank from the gallows. Having been denied a new trial by Judge Rohn, Frank's legal team escalated their appeal to the Georgia Supreme Court. They restated their case and, yet again, attempted to fix the blame on the factory sweeper, Jim Conley. After listening to the arguments and then weeks of reviewing the trial's transcripts, the Georgia Supreme Court rendered their decision. In a 4-2 vote, they declined to grant Leo Frank a new trial. Another devastating loss. However, in the wake of this disappointing ruling, Frank's legal team chalked up a handful of wins, at least with public perception. It was revealed that the strands of hair found on the machinery in the metal room did not, in fact, match the hair of Mary Fagan. Furthermore, some cried scandal when it was revealed that solicitor Hugh Dorsey, he knew about this the entire time during the trial and never said anything about it. There were also several notable retractions in early 1914. A handful of witnesses who testified against Leo Frank came forward and said that they either flat out lied about it or they were coerced to lie. One particular madam was one of them. Nina Formby had claimed that Leo Frank was a regular of hers at her house of ill repute. She said that on the day of the murder he'd called her, looking for a place to store Mary Fagan's body. However, Madame Formby later retracted her statement, saying she didn't even know Leo Frank, and that she'd been coerced to say that by some Atlanta detectives. Another one, George Epps. This was the kid who allegedly rode the streetcar with Mary on the day she died. Well, he admitted that his story was also made up, and that Detective John Black put him up to it. The defense was feeling better by the day. And they had a right to be. Especially when they found out that one of the biggest names in American journalism would be unofficially joining Team Frank. Adolph Oakes was the powerful publisher of the New York Times. He was also a Jewish man who'd been raised in the South. In February of 1914, the Times ran multiple front-page articles about the Leo Frank case and appeals process, and all of them were favorable towards Frank. At one point, they interviewed Luther Rosser, one of Frank's attorneys. They asked him why Frank was convicted in the first place. Here's Rosser's response. The Jewish population of Atlanta is not large. Frank came to Atlanta, a stranger and engaged in a new enterprise. He knew hardly anybody who was not of his own religion, being closely occupied with his business, and this fact rather counted against him. I really believe if Frank had been the son of a reputable Gentile, he would never have been arrested. What had been, during the trial, a mostly regional story was now becoming a national story. Around this same time, another influential Jewish man came to Frank's defense. Albert Lasker was a wealthy and seasoned advertising maven from Chicago. Though he attempted to remain off the radar, it's no secret why Lasker came to Atlanta: to help reshape the public opinion of Leo Frank. And over time, it seemed to work. More papers around the country began covering the story, and most of them were pretty positive towards Leo Frank. Two of the biggest names in American history even lent their names to the cause. Thomas Edison and Henry Ford publicly stated their belief that the Frank trial was rotten and that he deserved a new one. Now, Albert Lasker did more than just lead a PR effort. He also quietly hired the most famous private eye in the world, William Burns. Burns was a larger-than-life character with international fame. He was mythical, almost like a real-life Sherlock Holmes. He traveled the world investigating famous burglaries, salacious murders, and unbelievable heists. When the press found out Burns was taking up the Frank case, they lost their minds with excitement. A celebrity investigator was coming to Atlanta to once and for all solve the Mary Fagan murder mystery. When William Burns arrived at Atlanta's terminal station, he was besieged by reporters and photographers. In the following weeks, they followed him everywhere he went around the city. Burns boasted several times that, unlike the others, he would be able to crack the case. Burns and his team got to work. Despite a few positive developments in the case, Frank's legal team was running out of legal options. Days after the Georgia Supreme Court ruling, Frank appeared back in court. It was time to, once again, schedule the execution. The judge made his pronouncement. Frank would now die on April 17th, 1914. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, this date was Leo Frank's birthday, his 30th birthday. In February, there was also news with Jim Conley. On the 24th of that month, Conley was sentenced to 1 year on the Georgia State chain gang for his role as an accomplice in the murder of Mary Fagan. However, that wasn't all. After a few weeks on the job, Detective William Burns made a bombshell of an announcement. He had acquired a series of love letters written between Jim Conley and his jailhouse lover, a lady named Anna Maud Carter. It was something like 40 pages of handwritten letters. Now, the papers refused to print the content of these letters because they were just so vulgar. By the way, I've read some of these letters and I can confirm they're pretty saucy, even by today's standards. So I can imagine what someone in 1914 must have thought. What did these letters prove? Burns explains. They show beyond a peradventure of a doubt that Conley is an abnormal man, just the vile, degenerate creature that I have heretofore pictured him. Burns believed that this was proof that Conley was a monster, a twisted, sexual pervert, fully capable of killing Mary Fagan. Detective Burns also hired men to analyze the handwriting and syntax of the letters. He claimed that it was an identical match to the murder notes found near Mary's body. But then, the real zinger. This from the New York Times. Detective Burns also said that he believed he would be able to prove that Conley is the Jack the Ripper, who murdered about 20 Negro girls in the last 3 years. Each of these women was mutilated, and by the body of each, the murderer left a note. Some of the notes bear marked resemblance in words and handwriting to those found by Mary Fagan's body. This was a spectacular accusation, a potential bridge between two of the biggest news stories in Atlanta's history. Could it be that Jim Conley was not only the killer of Mary Fagan, but also the killer of all those young black women from a few years earlier? Could it be that Jim Conley was the Atlanta Ripper? Well, I'll say this. One red flag concerning the accuracy of this article is that Atlanta police did not, in fact, find a murder note by all the bodies of the Ripper victims. From my research, I only found a couple of instances where a note was left. So unless Atlanta police had been withholding this knowledge from the media, I'd seriously question that claim. So I'm not sure where the New York Times got that from. I will say, like many of the other women, Mary was murdered on a Saturday night. But that's circumstantial at best. Now, I'll go ahead and spoil this by telling you that nothing else really came from the William Burns Conley as the Ripper accusation / conspiracy theory. I've spent considerable time looking into this, and I can't really find much beyond this initial report that he sort of made that claim. After all this, the Anna Maud Carter letters, they would be discussed much more, and Dorsey would claim that Burns had forged them. They were fakes, he said. Well, Burns would counter that it wasn't a fake. At one point, Carter, Conley's jailhouse lover, claimed that Conley had privately confessed to her that he had killed Mary Fagan. But then she later retracted her statement, saying that someone had told her to say that. It's all really exhausting. When you really start digging into this case, all the claims and counterclaims and retractions are really just a huge cluster of confusion. It'll make your head spin. By the beginning of April, it was crunch time for Leo Frank's attorneys. They filed a new motion in the Fulton Superior Court that was well received. Frank's execution was pushed back yet again, this time to January of 1915. This bought Frank and his attorneys several more precious months to continue building their case towards his innocence. However, with more time comes more costs. By April, the costs associated with Frank's defense had become enormous. The fees of the lawyers, the private investigators, and others were north of $50,000 at this point. A push was made to raise funds, and several wealthy men, mostly Jewish, came to Frank's aid with sizable donations. And one of those men? President of the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill, Oscar Elsis. While Oscar Elsis was certainly keeping an eye on the Leo Frank drama, that was the least of his worries. By the spring of 1914, rumors of a strike at the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill were out of control. For the previous few months, Oscar had been dealing with all kinds of worker drama, and most worrisome of all, the U word was being tossed around. For a wannabe robber baron in the 1910s, there was no dirtier word than union. Employees at Fulton Bag were strictly forbidden from unionizing, and even talking about it could get them fired. From the end of 1913 through the beginning of 1914, Elsis had been on a quiet hunt, routing out anyone known to be a union sympathizer. He fired dozens of people he suspected of stirring up union talk. As the rumors of the discontent in Cabbagetown swirled, word somehow reached officials with United Textile Workers, UTW for short. UTW was a trade union that advocated on behalf of workers in the textile industry. Over the years, they'd been very successful in helping low-wage workers organize into unions that could apply pressure on factory owners. However, their efforts had been successful mostly in the North. Previous attempts to organize labor unions in the South had been met with fierce opposition. Charles Miles had organized several of those successful pro-union movements in cities in the North. However, he'd been recently tapped as the UTW's new Southern organizer. Miles attempted to organize at other mills around the South, but they all fell flat. After that, he shifted his focus to the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill in Atlanta. He hoped to tap into the unrest that already existed amongst the workers. That spring, he organized a local chapter of United Textile Workers. It would be called Local 886. Through March and April, Local 886 enlisted as many Fulton Bag workers as possible. Charles Miles knew that the only hope they had of making change was in recruiting more members to the union. As Oscar Elsis heard of these efforts to unionize, he retaliated, with even more firings. Anyone who showed interest or attended local meetings was instantly terminated. The remaining workers at the mill were furious as they saw one friend after another fired, not for poor performance, but for possibly being affiliated with the union. Charles Miles and his fellow leaders at Local 886 planned their counterpunch. They decided to organize a citywide meeting for Atlanta's textile workers, those at both Fulton Bag as well as the other large cotton mill in town, Exposition. They printed flyers and distributed them all throughout the mill village. You can see the actual flyer in the vault. Here's a snapshot of what the flyer said. Big, bold text. Workers' attention! A special meeting of the loom fixers, weavers, spinners, carders, and other operatives will be held in Chastain Hall. Friday evening, 8 p.m. Get together, unite, organize. The time is at hand when the cotton mill operatives must organize and secure for themselves and their families a larger share in the prosperity and progress of the age. A decent number of workers from both mills showed up to the meeting. Charles Miles led the proceedings, and the focus of conversation quickly turned to the possibility of a strike at the crown jewel of the Southern textile trade, the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill. Just a few days later, a second meeting was held, this one in the Oddfellows building down on Decatur Street. At this meeting, the union enlisted even more members, and once the meeting started, the primary topic of conversation? A strike at Fulton Bag. The pieces were falling into place. By May the 19th, the boiling point had been reached. You might even say that a sense of pervasive fatalism had set in. Workers met in a secretive meeting that night to air their grievances and plan their next move. They expressed deep resentment over the firing of their coworkers for being associated with the union. They criticized the dreaded labor contract. They decried the institution of child labor. They scoffed at their pitiful wages. And they cursed the filth and squalor of the mill village. When the dust settled, a decision had to be made. Would they continue with business as usual, or would they go on strike? It was put to a vote, submitted by secret ballot. After tabulating the results, it was nearly unanimous. 350 votes for and just 3 votes against. It was official. They would walk off the job the next morning. The people of Atlanta's humble Appalachian mill village were about to stage a revolt against one of the largest manufacturers in the American South. This was no small matter. Certainly not to the hot-tempered president of the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill. Oh no, to him this was no tepid offense. This wasn't just a little hiccup that would be placated through amicable negotiations. No. This was a unified movement of resistance against his cotton empire. And to him, it was nothing less than a declaration of war. Oscar Elsis was not the type of man to be caught unprepared. In fact, he already had a plan in place and near unlimited resources. How would he respond? We'll find out. Next time on Cat Lake. I teased it at the top of the episode, but I'm excited to announce our first guest at our Catlick Live finale. Atlanta comic David Perdue will be joining us as our host and MC for the night, and I'm super pumped. David is a friend of mine and recognized as one of the top comics in all of Atlanta. He's performed on Comedy Central, Fuse, and at comedy festivals all over the country. Join me and David and the rest of our Catlick Live finale lineup at Plywood Place here in Atlanta on March 14th. We've got an unbelievable night planned, plus a kick-ass after party at Monday Night Garage. Go get your tickets today before they sell out at catlick.com. And while you're there, you can also get tickets to our Catlick walking tours happening that same weekend. Once again, you can find all that information at catlick.com. Cheers. Catlick is recorded in Atlanta's historic Cabbagetown neighborhood. Executive producer, Walnut Ridge Harmon. Original music by Duciel. Cover art by Rachel Eleanor. Catlick store manager, Brett Harmon. Special thanks to the staff at the Georgia Institute of Technology Library, Archives, and Special Collections. Catlick Instagram Follower of the Week, Mandy Goodwin. Catlick Instagram Story Stars of the Week, Sham Breezy and Cat Wilder. Thanks for sharing, guys. Catlick Instagram Commenter of the Week, Major Nate 11, who says, "My wife is usually the crime aficionado in our house, but you have me hooked. Keep up the phenomenal work." Thank you, Major Nate 11. Only 4 episodes left, but I'll keep it up at least till then. Catlick Twitter Follower of the Week, Andrew Field. Our Vault subscribers have been loving the visual artifacts we've been posting lately. We're up to more than 300 images, and we're adding new stuff every week. As we continue talking about Cabbagetown, I'm going to be posting lots of photos from around the neighborhood today, and I'm even hoping to do a video tour of the cotton mill, what it looks like today. If you haven't done it yet, you can subscribe to The Vault at catlick.com. Just click on Vault. And finally, Catlick is independently written and produced by me, BT Harmon, signing off. I'd like to remind you to save old buildings, build bike lanes, and vote for public transit. We'll see you in the next episode.